Continuing the Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp. Chapter 6. At the Black Cat, which by this time honored me by turning me out, there had been one young man who had come in for a certain amount of notoriety by boasting that he was not on the game. In proof of this claim, he carried books under his arm and occasionally snubbed the other members of the clientele with snippets of literature, chiefly by Michael Arlen. He was the least likable of the lot. It was inevitably him that I got to know best. Being at the losing end of human relationships does not necessarily mean that you are perpetually climbing toward a vanishing ideal. After a while, your despondency may bring you to a halt, where you can be overtaken by absolutely anyone who wishes to know you. If I was standing still, and he was reaching up to me, he must have come from depths that only Dante could calculate. I didn't think of this. He was the only person of my own age whom I knew well and who lived by himself in London. Whenever I had saved up enough pocket money to pay the fare from High Wycombe, I went to stay with him for weekends. Once I even allowed myself to be nagged into inviting him for a day or two to my parents' house. He was short, with black hair ending in a staccato manner in the back, and his thumbnails were wider than they were long. When my mother saw them, she made the special face that people make when they hear a knife skidding across a tin plate. She was very good at this expression. Toward the end of her life, she went into it whenever fingernails were even mentioned. She was halfway there by nature, having a high bridge to her nose, hooded eyes, and lips that were made for sucking a lemon. When the time came for me to leave home for good, with a red handkerchief full of cosmetics tied to a birch rod over my shoulder, it was toward these thumbnails that I turned my steps. The world lay all before me, like a trap-door. In letters so voluminous that the postman scarcely had strength to deliver them, we had made our plans. My friend had taken a flat in Barron's Court, which we shared for 3 months. He seemed genuinely pleased that we were going to live together. I am so constituted that if I am told someone does not like me, I say, "Why?" But if I am told that they do, I only put my head on one side and lower my eyelids. I therefore never asked myself what on earth this man hoped to gain by setting up house with me. We were not lovers, and soon we were not friends, but he never told me to go, though within weeks it transpired that I was a dead loss. I had no capacity to survive. He had probably guessed that if our lot was to be improved, he would have to drag me forward. But after living with me for a week, he knew that if our affairs were merely to stay the same, he would have to hold me up. He had visited my home and seen that I was invincibly middle class, or worse. My mother had a faint Cockney accent, but I may have seemed to him to be of high degree. Perhaps he thought that, one day, something must come of all the talents I claimed by implication to possess. I never stopped quoting my own stories, plays, and poems. If he did think this, it would have carried a great weight, for what Mr. Haggard was to me, Mr. Arlen was to him. He lived in an all-pervading dream about the well-born, the well-paid, and the well-publicized. About the worship of talent and fame there is something gay and forward-looking. A neophyte may one day achieve some measure of these things for himself, but I can never help flinching from a display of undue reverence for titles. It seems so hopeless and self-wounding. This young man fell upon the thorns of class. He bled. Nothing would induce him, he once told me, to have his shoes cleaned in the street. It was such a cruel display of the master-servant relationship. When we were camping, one sunny day, with some men laying pipes in Hyde Park, he was shattered because one of the working men, said of a roll of putty that he was manipulating, "The more you play with it, the longer it gets. It's like a navvy's prick." While I was trying to pretend that I had not heard this affront to my maidenly modesty, Thumbnails was recovering from the pain of having heard a laborer pierce himself to the heart by calling himself a navvy. For whatever prestige he hoped my companionship would bring him, my companion paid a punishing price. It was 1931. I had no job, and most of the time he had none. We were driven to some dodgy expedients, and he had not only to run risks on my behalf, but also to put up with my unconcealed disgust for the methods by which he provided food that my moral compunction never prevented me from eating. As we all know from witnessing the consuming jealousy of husbands who are never faithful, people do not confine themselves to the emotions to which they are entitled. Our great money-saving device was used on the chain tea shops, ABC, Lyons, etc. We patronized them, or should I say they patronized us, only during rush hours, going in separately but sitting together. We ate fast so as not to use up all the rush hour, and asked for separate bills so that we could leave one at a time. We took it in turns to go first. Whoever did this went to the pay desk and changed sixpence into coppers to make a telephone call, so that the manageress would see him speak to the cashier. If he was challenged, he said his friend was paying. Whoever remained behind could try anything. He could pass the cash desk in the crowd, he could say his friend had paid, he also could ask for pennies to make a telephone call. But against this move there would, in any chess book, be a bracketed question mark. He could pay his own bill, or he could admit defeat and pay both. This almost never happened. In 6 months, we nearly always ate 1 or 2 meals free a day. I did not object to these felonies because they were against the law. My very existence was illegal. I was embarrassed by their pettiness, and cross because, if I were apprehended in connection with any of them, the snow-white brand image of a homosexual person, toward which I had begun intermittently to work, would be dimmed. So far, however, I couldn't really afford virtue, so I settled for indignation with vice. It served roughly the same purpose, and was much cheaper. While I was still living in Barron's Court, my father won his great gamble with the future. He died. On hearing of the death of anyone I have known well, I have usually experienced a slight thrill of pleasure. Another witness to my stupidity or weakness has been silenced. When the telegram announcing my father's death arrived, I felt nothing except irritation at the thought of having to go home, attend the funeral, and come back. Though I loathed my life in London, I knew that this was what I must do. If I stayed away, the same nagging from my family would begin all over again. Not that I was free from being nagged in London. Indeed, reprimands constituted almost the whole of my flatmates' discourse, especially when we were in public. While we sat in the various tea shops or walked along the streets, smiling and nodding so as to seem to strangers to be talking airily of this and that, he was saying, "You look terrible. Push your hair back from your forehead." Not abruptly as though I had mentioned it. Casually. That's a bit better. "And for God's sake, don't look so crushed. Smile." This kind of nagging I hardly minded at first. It made everything I did or said or looked a matter of importance. But as feelings of hunger, hopelessness, and hatred began to weaken even my interest in myself, I started to long to get away. Freedom did not come for 6 months. Before then my talent for attracting public ridicule was to be put to the greatest test so far. I went on the stage. One evening Thumbnails, introducing himself as a journalist, arrived in the dressing-room of the specialty dancer of a pantomime in Hammersmith. One of her numbers had included a few hit-or-miss fouettes. He told her that if, on a given night, she were to do 32 of these steps, it would constitute a record and be worth mentioning in the papers. On the night in question, the pantomime dancer, in fact, shuddered to a halt after barely beginning her marathon. But journalism, like the light of lights, looks on the motive, not the deed, and the story was printed just the same. When the papers came out, everybody kissed everybody, and the dancer was so grateful that she allowed herself to be persuaded to take part in a charity matinee at the Scala Theatre, in aid of some hospital or other. In order to stay on stage for more than a 2-minute solo, which she fully intended to do, for her charity toward hospitals must not be doubted, the dancer explained that she must have a partner to wave his arms while she changed her costume and got her breath back. My flatmate assured her that he knew just the person for the job. Except for fighting with my little friend on the stage of Sutton Town Hall and playing the part of a madman in High Wycombe amateur theatricals, I had had no previous stage experience whatsoever. But by this time my whole life was an unsympathetic part played to a hostile audience. I felt that I had already done sufficient basic training. For the part of the act that involved me, the dancer had decided to do an acrobatic solo that she knew by heart, with me as a sort of visible stage-hand. This number showed her as an idol enthroned on an altar and me as a slave, the Oriental equivalent of a church brass cleaner. With matters arranged thus, a few sketchy rehearsals were thought to be sufficient. When the curtain went up on this part of the bill, I was revealed with my back to the audience, in I can't remember whose pajama trousers, with my upper half sporadically coated with slave white. I looked like an insufficiently basted chicken. As I moved one arm, commanding a second layer of curtains to part, there was a deafening roar of laughter. I took this calmly. To me it was just like Piccadilly Circus. My partner must have been a bit surprised. She went bravely on, however, twisting, turning, writhing, while I ran about the stage or clung to her for support, literally streaking her unattainable whiteness with my orange makeup. As long as I was moving, the audience kept on laughing. When the curtain came down, we could have continued to bow until our discs slipped. The audience would have applauded forever. Chapter 7. By this time my companion and I were living in King's Cross, a much more fertile region than the one we had just left. Baron's Court had been a no-man's land, in which the houses were blind with stained glass, and on the pavements raw trees no thicker than your arm stood in straitjackets of chicken wire, wincing at every breath of wind. Our new location was loud with the noise of steam trains, and lousy with tea shops that had a well-defined rush hour. Things were better without, but they had grown worse within. We now shared a double room for which the rent was 11 shillings each, and we were almost never apart. My roommate's idea of companionship included having me sit on the edge of the bath while he cleaned his teeth. My aversion caused me to live in a state of tension every moment that I was not alone, but the middle-class morality in which I had been so carefully reared prevailed. I hissed, but I almost never shouted. I don't expect that this self-restraint would have lasted indefinitely, but it didn't have to. After 3 months in King's Cross, news reached me from my mother, which broke the siege. My mother had a genius for making and keeping friends. This talent was instinctive and was exercised without a hope of profit. It was merely my good fortune that at least twice she was able to turn it to my account. The woman who many years before had introduced us to Mrs. Longhurst now, for my mother's sake, persuaded one of the directors of a vast firm of consulting electrical engineers to give me employment. I was absolutely amazed. He paid me £2 10 a week for 18 months before coming to his senses. Until I had been in work long enough to become eligible for the dole, 15 shillings 3 pence a week. I almost held my breath. After that point was passed, my relief became evident in my general demeanor, and particularly in the returning length of my hair and fingernails. Even greater than my joy at the prospect of one day being able to draw unemployment insurance was my ecstasy at moving into a room of my own. Once I had achieved this, I was happy. All the reactions that other people have described to me when at last they found someone to live with, the heightened perception of the world around them, the inability to refrain from taking little skips as they walked, all these were mine on realizing that I might with luck never have to live with anyone again. I was happy. The room I took, and even this I couldn't find without the help of the roommate I was so gladly leaving, was in darkest Pimlico. It had Nottingham lace curtains at the window, corned beef linoleum on the floor, and a brass bedstead in one corner. Some of my friends said how lucky I was to have been let in, while others laughed the room to scorn and implored me to chee-chee it up. I didn't listen. I was happy. At work I never once understood what I was doing. In theory I was employed as an engineer's tracer. This was one of the many kinds of work at which I could never hope to become proficient. Accuracy is alien to my nature. Many years later, a woman asked me what a point was. When I told her it was a 72nd part of an inch, she said, "But there isn't such a thing, really, is there?" That is what I have always secretly thought. When I was given plans to trace, I copied the mistakes as well as the revisions, and neither of them properly. When I was told to transfer the positions of electric pylons from one map to another, I did so with such a jolly laugh that construction men telephoned from distant shires to ask what on earth was going on at head office. If any housewife has a pylon among her rose bushes, if any country clergyman has a pylon sticking up through his church roof, if any borough surveyor has a pylon blocking his main thoroughfare, may he or she read here that I apologize. May it comfort them to know that I was happy. When I was not at work, I sat in my room and wrote plays, poems, libretti, stories, which were never to see the light of publication. The crippling weakness of all these works was that the ideas they sought to embody were far too highbrow for my sub-Tennysonian style. This is the main fault in all the writings that I have ever read in manuscript. The poverty from which I have suffered could be diagnosed as Soho poverty. It comes from having the airs and graces of a genius and no talent. But I was happy. On evenings when I felt that I could write no more, I went to visit friends, boys from the cafes who had rooms in houses where no landladies fly, or girls with whom I had been at art school. The journey there and back I nearly always made on foot to show that I could. It was getting harder all the time. Exhibitionism is like a drug. Hooked in adolescence, I was now taking doses so massive that they would have killed a novice. Blind with mascara and dumb with lipstick, I paraded the dim streets of Pimlico, with my overcoat wrapped around me as though it were a tailless ermine cape. I had to walk like a mummy leaving its tomb. At every step one foot had to land directly in front of the other. My knees ground together. After about a mile of walking thus, my trousers began to wear out between the knees. After 2 miles, I began to wear out. Sometimes I wore a fringe so deep that it completely obscured the way ahead. This hardly mattered. There were always others to look where I was going. As my appearance progressed from the effeminate to the bizarre, the reaction of strangers passed from startled contempt to outraged hatred. They began to take action. If I was compelled to stand still in the street in order to wait for a bus, or on the platform of an underground railway station, people would turn without a word and slap my face. If I was wearing sandals, passers-by took care to stamp on my toes. And once a crowd had started to follow me, it grew and grew until no traffic could pass down the road. If I didn't put a stop to this quickly, by getting on a bus or going into a shop, the police had to deal with it. Barging his way through the yelling crowd or coming at me from a side street, the constable would say, "You again, move on." Then, turning on the rabble with raised arms, he would tell them that it was over, that there was nothing to see, both of which statements were untrue. In a weary voice he would implore them to pass along the pavement. I was excited, exhausted, and worried by these crowds, but because I had never yet been savaged by them, I was not frightened. Because I still believed that I could educate them, I was happy. Chapter 8. Homosexuals have time for everybody. This is not only an instance of the known law that all outsiders are polite to insiders, because at best they secretly revere them, or at worst fear that they may one day need them. Homosexuals are sincerely interested. They will sit for hours on stairs, while chars complain about their rheumatism. They will stand at street corners while postmen rage against the handwriting of correspondence. They will pay extra fares to hear conductors rail against their wives. Every detail of the lives of real people, however mundane it may be, seems romantic to them. Romance is that enchantment that distance lends to things, and homosexuals are in a different world from the dead normals, with many light years dark between. If by some chance an hour of pointless gossip makes fleeting reference to some foible, some odd superstition, some illogical preference that they find they share with the speaker, homosexuals are as amazed and delighted as an Earthman would be on learning that Martians cook by gas. I have this lust for small talk. Nobody escapes my love. When I was not writing my interminable manuscripts or stalking the streets, I was scrabbling away with my bare hands at the hearts of all the people who couldn't get away. At this time my friends were few because of the difficulties attendant upon knowing me. Many I could never visit because they had resident husbands, fathers, or landladies. Others I could visit occasionally, but not meet in public because it was too embarrassing. On the other hand, there was a handful who hardly liked my company at all, but loved to cling to my arm in the street and fracture themselves with merriment, while housewives hissed and workmen spat upon the ground before my gilded toes. All were welcome in my room in Denby Street. Among my visitors were the student from High Wycombe and the student from Battersea, whose cousin, when alone with me, flung herself on the floor at my feet and said she wasn't worthy of me. This was true, but I never understood why she brought the subject up. A male prostitute, renamed Greta on account of his reverence for Garbo, used to call, and a model whom I had met in Hyde Park, who brought with him a Czech gentleman with an unspellable name. But my most faithful guests were an Irish boy, his friend who was a deserter from the Seaforth Highlanders, and a girl who ran a shuttle service between them. My friendship with the Irishman was a sexless variation on a well-known theme. I have no doubt that I met him at the Marble Arch. In those days there must have been a picture of this monument and a map of the surrounding streets on the wall of every gentleman's lavatory in Cardiff, Glasgow, Belfast, and points west. For whenever a ruined Celt arrived in London, this is where he came to rest. Or should I say work? And the sort of man who liked that sort of thing could go there and pick one of these boys from the wall as though he were plucking a peach, which, indeed, some of the specimens resembled. If these down-and-outs were innocent when they arrived and merely stood about at Marble Arch in order to be with their countrymen, they soon learned to tap the steamers and before long to aim for the rich-looking homosexuals. It was especially the Irish who concentrated on these. They felt that with them they could run up and down the scales of flattery without a hint of pianissimo. Though they did this for venal ends, they also enjoyed it. It was the exercise of their native genius. As Italian is the language of song, Irish is the voice of flattery. From the lips of these young men I have heard phrases so archaic and hyperboles so florid that even Mr. Singh could not have used them without a giggle. When they gave it up, you knew they liked you. This was the stage in our friendship that the Irish boy and I had reached by the time he was my guest in Pimlico. Though, mercifully, the flattery dies, the hard luck story never fades. If I were asked what the word con meant, I would say that it was something done by impecunious Irishmen to English queers. So the reason why the Irishman, his friend, and their girl called on me so often was because they were always in need of sixpence. Knowing someone poorer than myself, when I only earned £2 10 shillings, was a luxury, and I usually tried to indulge myself as well as them. Their own description of the situation was that they tapped me unmercifully. But if I refused them a loan they never turned nasty, and when I gave them something I never asked for it to be returned, or suggested that they should do anything to deserve it. In this way our friendship was kept pleasant for a great many years. It faded gracefully as time and the world intervened. While I lived in Pimlico and worked at my first job, I did not reach that state of terrible gaiety that I was to achieve later. To some extent I still lived in the future, a habit which is the death of happiness. I wrote a play about Helen of Troy, and looked forward to the day when it would be published along with a lot of other works. I still hoped to find tolerance for my kind, and love for myself, though I now saw that this could not be reached by means of sex. It would be less true to say that I saw through sex than to say that I no longer saw through it. It had ceased to be a door to a sustaining relationship. It had become its slightly distasteful self. For many years I was at least happy enough to live without sexual encounters at all. Sex is the last refuge of the miserable. All the same, I indulged in fantasies of living the public life of a famous writer, painter, or actor, combined with the private life of a clean-up odalisque. When I switched these dreams off and came to terms with my true expectations, I could not avoid seeing that I was always going to have a very circumscribed life. If traveling to Ealing was like embarking on a crusade, I could be fairly sure that I was never going to Rome or Paris or New York. If it had taken me 22 years to crawl into a job that I could only do badly, I was never likely to live the briefcase life. I must not expect that I would ever have money or influence. I had better decide on some one small thing that I really wanted, and aim to achieve some measure of that. I chose happiness, and, like Bernard Shaw's serpent, I set about willing what I had imagined, and creating what I had willed. The essence of happiness is its absoluteness. It is automatically the state of being of those who live in the continuous present all over their bodies. No effort is required to define or even attain happiness, but enormous concentration is needed to abandon everything else. Graham Greene has boasted that wherever we can show him happiness, he will show us ignorance, selfishness, and greed. Had his words been written 40 years ago, I would have known that much sooner that happiness was something for which I was naturally equipped. Unfortunately, there are two other requirements, good health and solvency. The first of these prerequisites I have enjoyed almost continuously since people ceased to look after me, but the second has failed me at several periods of my life. One such wave of penury was to engulf me within a week of leaving my job with the electrical engineers. Thank you for listening. Continued in the next installment.